Hey designers, and welcome to the hierarchy skill. This is such a core fundamental design skill that so many designers get wrong. So I'm excited to go over this and give you this skill. So in this video, we're going to cover what is hierarchy and why is it so important. Then we're going to talk about the principles for creating good hierarchy. And then we're going to talk about the different tools that you have to create good hierarchies. And then I'm actually going to show you the process. I'm going to give you a demo of how I use these principles to create good hierarchy. All right, so let's dive into it. Let's start with what is actually hierarchy. Well, hierarchy is basically just a system for ranking things. What is more important than something else? So you can think about it this way. You know, when there's a group, let's say you and your group of friends, there's no hierarchy. You're all the same. Nobody is the boss of other people. But when in different organizations, let's say in the military, there is like a top commander who has the other sub-commanders who are commanders of other people, right? There is a very clear ranking system that tells you who is on the top, right? In every company that we work with, usually there's like a CEO, and then there are VPs, and then there are the mid-managers. There is a very clear hierarchies, who's on the top and who is on the bottom. Okay, so why am I actually talking about, you know, the military and stuff when we're actually trying to understand how to become better designers? Well, the thing is that our role as designers is to guide the attention of the users who are looking at the design or are using the design that we have created. Now, imagine in the army, if every single person in the army would say, hey, let's go over there. No, let's go over there. And there's no clear decision-making process, and there's no one person that is more important than other people. It'll just be a mess. And the same is true when it comes to design. So let me give you an example. Check out this design. In this design, what you can see is everybody thinks they're the boss. Everybody's hey, look at me. I'm a very important title. Over 500 million. Oh no, but here's another pop-up. This is very important. You should look here. Oh, but here's an image. Take a look at here. Oh, but the logo is also very important. Every element on this design thinks that they are the most important thing, and it's very, very confusing and disoriented. And so that is actually bad design because we can't figure out what the hell is going on here. Okay, so here are the principles that we need to follow when we are creating a design. First of all, we need to understand that there has to be some kind of a hierarchy, right? Usually we'll create 3 levels of a hierarchy, meaning the most important thing, a medium important thing, and less important things. And just like the military, there should only probably be just one thing who is at the top. Maybe there's 2 kind of sub-niches, sub-segments, and then there may be a bunch of very, very small things. But the core thing, the things that are most important, there should only be one of these. Otherwise, it's probably too confusing. Now, the second principle is the way that we create hierarchies in design is by contrast. Our brain as humans has evolved in a way of us noticing things by their ranking. If something is very important, if it threatens us, right? If there's a lion coming at us, we should pay attention to that thing. So our brain has evolved in a way that we notice things that are bigger or things that are moving or things that are contrasted from the background. We tend to notice these things first. And as designers, we need to learn how to understand with these patterns to create contrast, to explain what is more important than other people. And we'll dive into how exactly are we doing this. The third principle that you should take in mind when you are designing is it should be very, very easy to understand what's the hierarchy, like who's number 1 in the ranking, who's number 2. If there's a confusion, again, think about the military or think about any organization where nobody's really sure who the boss is. If there's a confusion around who's number 2 and who's number 3, it's going to create a mess. So the hierarchy and the contrast between number 1, number 2, and number 3 needs to be very, very clear and well-defined and easy to understand. Okay, so let's talk about the toolbox of hierarchy. We have 5 different tools that we can use to create hierarchies. We have scale, color, position, depth, and motion. Now let's dive into each of them and see how they come into play and how we can use them. In real life, I'm going to discuss each of them right now in separately so that you can learn how to understand how to use them. But in real life, and we'll see this later on, they're usually in a kind of a combination. They're all coming into play together. So let's start with the first one and let's talk about scale. So imagine that you have 3 circles on your artboard and they're all the same size. Well, in that case, there's no real hierarchy, right? We don't really know where to look at first. They're just all the same. However, if one of them is way bigger, we immediately notice that one first. It doesn't really matter if he's on the left. It doesn't really matter if they're on the right or in the middle. Once something is way bigger than other things, again, just because of the brain, our brain operates that way, we notice that thing first and we associate bigger with more important. So if you want to make something more important, make it bigger. That being said, if the contrast is not clear, if something is bigger but not clearly bigger, that can still be misleading. So make sure that there is contrast, because if something is just a tiny bit bigger, that's still not going to be contrasted enough. So that's an example of a bad hierarchy. Now, a good example, and something that we'll do over and over again in design, is create 3 hierarchies where something is very, very big, something is medium size, and something is small, and we can definitely and very easily say which is which. And this is something that we'll do over and over again in design and also when we're laying out information. So let me show you this in kind of like real world example. So here we have 2 kind of posters. On the left, you can see that we've put a bunch of things. We've put a title and an image and a subtitle here, but they're all grabbing our attention. Now, when you look at text, you actually look at it as kind of a block, right? Because text is a block of color. So if you squint your eyes at this left design, you'll actually see that the shape, the dark shape of the text above the boat is actually the same size pretty much as the boat. And so they are both pretty much at kind of the same hierarchy. And so again, that creates a confusion. I don't know where should I look at first. Should I look at the boat first, or should I spend time reading the title first? They're contrasting. And then also the subtitle at the bottom is quite big and bold as well. So it's also grabbing my attention. The design on the right, as you can see, it's very, very clear. We have a very clear number 1, number 2, and number 3, because the darkest thing, which creates the biggest kind of like dark area on this design, is the boat, and it's using kind of like a lot of color to create this contrast, and it's very big. The other thing, and I'm talking about this in terms of sizes of the elements in general, right? So the second thing is the calm before the storm. I'm looking at this whole object as one medium-sized object, and then we have the subtitle really tiny here at the bottom, and it's very, very clear that's the third thing that you should be looking at. So that is a very, very clear design that shows you the pace and the steps that you should look at when you're looking at this design. Let's look at another book cover and see what happens when we're using just one size for all text. Well, because I don't understand what's the difference between all of this type, I'm going to have to read this all thing. I'm going to have to look at all the text as one block or maybe 2 blocks, just because they are separated by space, but they're still kind of like the same hierarchy. So that's very, very confusing. If we take a look at the right, you can see that we have the title of the book, Scale Hierarchy Guide, as the top thing. This is a very big block of color. Then as a secondary thing, it's actually not the Biflux Academy, even though it's right below it, because our eyes are jumping immediately to the second biggest thing on the page, which is everything you need to do to master a common type of visual hierarchy. That's a second size, just because the type is medium-sized here. And then at the end, the third hierarchy here is Biflux Academy, because it's very, very small. So that's the way our eyes are going to analyze this design. Now, when you're looking at something like web design, there's going to be tons of element probably on the page, right? So we have the logo, we have buttons, we have an image, we have titles. But if you look at the design on the left, I'm really not sure which one is more important. Should I first look at the person but actually the logo, it grabs my attention first because it's a big black, big black area. And then also the shop for our sale button is also very big and grabbing my attention. So it's not really well defined. I'm not really sure. So my eye is just jumping confused from element to element. When we're looking at the design on the right, it's actually very clear, right? The image that has been scaled up and zoomed out and to our face, we can look at the person as the first thing, besides the fact that, by the way, people looking at cameras is something that grabs attention and we connect to as people because we, as humans, we recognize faces. We look at the person first, and then we jump to the main headline, Beard Hacks for Men, and then we go into the third hierarchy, which is the black button. And then we have two of them, but as I've mentioned, when it comes down to third hierarchies and then we have the small text, that's okay if we have multiple elements, because the way that we skim through designs is we start with the important things, and then only if that's interesting enough for us, then we're going to explore the less important things. So it's okay that there are more less important things. Okay, the second thing that helps us create hierarchy is color. Now, there are two ways that we can use color to create hierarchy. So again, let's imagine that we have 3 circles on a page, same size, so there's no hierarchy between them. Well, the first way to create hierarchy is to reduce the brightness of some elements, and then the one that has that is the brightest or has the most contrast from the background will light up first because that is the most contrasted element. So you can do this by either reducing the brightness, the color brightness, or a lot of times we would even lower the opacity, how opaque an element is, and by reducing the opacity, we're kind of merging it with the background and making it less important and less contrasted. So reducing brightness and contrast with the background is number one. The second way that we can contrast is by changing the hue. So different colors might be more or less contrasted to the background. Of course, that depends on what your background is. In this case, if we'll take green circles and a yellow circle, the yellow circle is much more contrasted on the background, and therefore we will see it first, and it will be the top hierarchy in this design. As I've mentioned in the scale, we can use these elements, but it will still create confusion, right? So in this case, I'm using 3 different colors, but it's not immediately understandable or clear who is more contrasted. Yes, they are different, but the difference between them are so minimal that it's really just a mess. It doesn't create any hierarchy. Now, it's okay to use different colors just to create, a mess or to convey a message about colorfulness, but if you want to use colors to create hierarchy, this is a bad example of using colors to create hierarchy. Now, here's a good example, and these are actually the colors that we're using right now in Flux Academy. Here we have 3 colors. We have purple, then we have a pink, and then we have white. And depending on the background, you can see the white is the most contrasted one in this example. The pink is somewhere in the middle, and the purple, at least on a dark background, is the least most contrasted. So it's very clear that we have 1, 2, 3 here. There's no confusion about what is most contrasted with these color scheme. So let me show you 2 examples. So in the example on the left, we have, if we're looking at the most contrasted elements that we have here, it's probably the title and the 2 images that we have. However, if we decide that what's important for us is to make the Contact Us button grab more attention, because that's a priority, one thing that we might do is reduce the opacity or reduce the contrast of the images while increasing the brightness of the button to make it pop and make it more contrasted on the background. Now, something important to say is there is no right hierarchy or wrong hierarchy. You set the decision on what's important. It's only matter that you make a decision about what's important, but there is no right or wrong in terms of what is important. Every project has different goals, and so you pick the hierarchy based on the goals of the project. Now, here's another example, and in this example, we have a price for the object that we're trying to sell, but in the left example, the first thing that grabs our attention here is probably either the image or the big title of new leather jackets, just because it's black and it's a kind of a big black area on our design. But if we decide that what we want to show is maybe it's a button, or maybe we just want to grab attention to the name of this item and its price, then we can use a different color to make it pop, make it way more contrasted, and make sure that people see it before they look at other things. All right, the next thing in our toolbox is a position. Now, we can use position to take something out of a group and therefore making it stand out. So if we have a bunch of elements on our page and they're all aligned together, none of them stands out. However, if one of them is going out of the group, is being misaligned to the group, immediately, because our brain tends to group things together, and if something is not in the group, we will look at there first. If we have that design, we will immediately look at the ball dropping first, and then look at all of the balls that look like they are aligned into one line. Now, position can also be used by not putting things somewhere, right? Position can be leaving empty space, what is called white space in design. Now, by filling out an area with just space, it allows the eye to focus on this element. So if you notice on this example that we have here, the fact that one circle has no balls around it and kind of creates a space around it actually creates the feeling that our eye looks at him versus looking at the group. Again, when we have a lot of objects together, our minds tend to look at them as a group. And so again, by using space, we're taking something out of the group and creating the feeling that this object is standing out. Now, here's an example of things are not misaligned. However, I'm not really sure if this is just because you want to show me something of a wave, or just because you're trying to make one of the objects stand out. It's not really clear if this was done on purpose or this is a mistake. So this is not a way to create hierarchy, right? If you want to make sure that something stands out, you have to be clear that only it stands out. If everything stands out, nothing stands out. Okay. One thing about position is you have to remember position is not just moving things around, it can also be rotating things. So when we're looking at this example, we can see that we have object that looks exactly the same, but just because one of them is rotated, the position of it is different, that would grab our attention to it, because again, our eyes are drawn immediately into places that are out of the ordinary, that are looking a little bit different. We want to understand, hey, what's wrong here? Why is this like this? And so if you want to grab attention, sometimes rotating an element and taking it out of the normal alignment of the other element can help to grab that attention. So I want to demonstrate an example of how just positioning something in different location can change the hierarchy of how we're reading things. So if you look at the example on the right, the way that we usually read books, websites, anything is actually from the top left down, right? We usually read from left to right, and then we read a page from top to bottom. So that's our reading pattern. And so on the example on the left, because we're scanning this design from top to bottom, we'll first see the little woman standing there in the middle with a contrasting color, and then we'll get into the actual title of this book cover. However, in the second example, just because we put the type on the top left corner, we're going to scan this first and only then going to reach the other woman below. One more thing that you can also see here is that the type is actually more contrasted also on the top versus on the bottom, and that also helps it to see it first. So really you need to make up your mind as to what do you want people to notice first, and this will help you understand how to position things. All right, one more thing that we can use as a tool to create hierarchy is depth. And this is, again, something just that our brain are more tending to see what's in focus, right? Our eyes can focus on one thing. When we're taking photos, we're focusing on one thing. And so when we have an object that is sharp versus objects that are blurred, it's easier for us and our attention is being grabbed into the object that is focused. We tend to think that it is closer, that it's probably more important, and also its edges are more contrasted from the background. Okay? Now, I remind you that usually in real life and photos and other things, things that are closer to you and not blurred will also be bigger. So as I've mentioned earlier, a lot of times all of these tools of hierarchies in real life, they are combined. It's not just focus versus unfocused, not just big versus small, not just bright versus dimmed. All of these things are coming in together. Now, the reason that I'm talking about depth here is because in photography, a lot of times we're using depth to create hierarchy. So as you might know, if you're familiar with photography, there's something that's called depth of field, which basically means how blurred the background is, right? So if you notice here on the image on the right, we can see the person, but we can also see the trees in the background and the building in the background. And of course, we can see him, but there's a lot of things in this image that grab our attention. While we look at the image on the left, when only the person is sharp and all the background is blurred, it's very, very easy for us to notice. We will notice first the person, and that's the main thing that we will look at. So you have to remember that as a designer, you'll be using a lot of images as well, and you have to look at the image as well and think, what is the hierarchy in this image and how does that work inside the whole general design? And sometimes using blur, whether it is because the photo was filmed that way, or maybe you've created an effect in Photoshop or something like that, you can use blurring to bring out one element and make the hierarchy of this specific element higher as a design decision. All right, the last thing is motion. Again, coming back from us being in the jungle, afraid that a tiger is going to jump at us and eat us, we have the attention. When something is moving, we want to notice that first, right? That's just how our brain works. And so when something is moving on a page, specifically in a website, we're seeing some kind of a video, immediately our attention is drawing into the moving things. And I want to show you this website example. And here you can see that there's actually two things. So the video, the background of this website is a video. So immediately it grabs our attention. Something is happening there. It's interesting. It's moving. It grabs our attention. So that becomes the top hierarchy on this page. However, you can also see that the sun is kind of rotating slowly. And so that also grabs our attention. But because it's moving slower and because the object in general is slower, that becomes the second hierarchy, while the type, even though it's big, even though it's contrasted, in general, it might have been the first hierarchy. Just because of the movement, it's going to be the third thing that we notice after we're looking at the moving images. Okay, so now that we've covered all the different toolbox, let's see how they come together. And here's the process that we usually work through. The first thing that we have to do is we have to make a decision about what the hierarchies are, right? Before you go ahead and put things on the page and start to resize them, make a conscious decision about what is most important. What is the number one most important thing? What is the secondary thing that's important? And the rest is probably going to be low hierarchy. You have to make this as a conscious decision. Again, as I've mentioned, there is no right and wrong. Every project may have different hierarchies. This is something that you need to understand. And sometimes you need to be in alignment with your client that you're actually working towards the right hierarchies. One thing that clients sometimes struggle with is they think that everything is the most important thing. And you have to communicate to them. You have to explain to them, look, if everybody is the CEO, if everybody is the top commander, nobody's going to listen, right? It's going to be a complete mess. There's can only be one person that is most important, and then we have to go from there. So you have to limit the amount of most important thing. You have to be conscious of it. Now that you've made your decision, now it's time to kind of apply the tools, probably in combination, and then when you finished doing your design, you can kind of squint your eyes like we did when we covered the example and try to look at the general shapes and contrast. Is it easy to really notice what is the top priority, secondary priority, and all the rest? Or it might be a little bit confusing. That would kind of help you understand if you've chosen and you've clarified the hierarchies in your design. All right, let's jump into a demo and I'll show you how I do it. Okay, so let's imagine I have to design this website, and it's a website for cabins. I like cabins in the woods. So this is a website. Let's say this is the hero of the website, and these are the elements that we need to have on it. We need to have a logo, we need to have a navigation, we need to have a title and a little description about it, and we need to have a button for a call to action. And then also we want to have this image of the actual cabin that people can book. Now, before I go ahead and start designing the elements and structuring them, I have to make the decision about what is important to me. So what are the hierarchies? So let's try multiple ones. In the first one, let's imagine that the most important for me is the title here. I want people to read the title, and I want people to be able to see the call to action. Now, let's try and put this image here. And then, first of all, we notice that what we see here is mainly the image, right? Because it is so bright and the other elements lack contrast, the only thing we actually see here is the image. So this is really not what we want here. Now, there's, of course, infinite ways to solve it, and I'm just going to show a few examples, but the way that you solve this issue doesn't really matter as long as you understand what you're trying to do. And right now, what we try to do is reduce the hierarchy of the image. So one way to do that would be let's just reduce its opacity. And if we reduce its opacity and the background behind it is black, then it's being reduced, there's less contrast, and now there's more contrast to the things here that we're seeing. So that is a good first step to reduce the hierarchy of the image itself. Now, in terms of the other hierarchies, our number one hierarchy is the title, but there's no very clear hierarchy here. Let me just zoom out, and you can see that the amount of white space that being created by this title is actually less than the amount of white area created by this text here and even the button. So definitely there's no clear or contrasted enough hierarchy here. So let's go ahead and just make this text way bigger. Now this is very, very clear in terms of hierarchies. Now, when I'm looking at this, the first thing that I very clearly see is I see the cabin, the headline. Now, what do I see next? Currently, the thing that I see next is the second biggest white area, which is this paragraph, but that's actually not what I want. I want people to notice this as a secondary thing. So, of course, there are infinite ways to change this button in order to increase its hierarchy. What we're going to do is we're just going to give it kind of a fill to this button, and let's add this red color as a fill. And now you can see it's being contrasted by color. We didn't change its size. This time we changed color, and by changing its color, now it's grabbing more attention than this because it's contrasted with the color. So looking at this right now, we're seeing number one, the headline, number two, we see the call to action, and number three is actually everything else. Everything else is less important, whether it is the image or these texts. Basically, this design is ready, right? It fulfills the goals that we have for priority number one, the headline, and then secondary priority, the call to action. Now let's move forward and try to see something a little bit more complicated. So let's say we actually have three hierarchies. We actually want people to notice this beautiful cabin here as a first thing, and only then we want them to see the headline and then this call to action. After all, we're selling the cabins. We want people to notice them. All right, so how do we change the hierarchies to bring this up from number three to actually number one? Well, let's start by bringing it back. It was first to begin with just because it was beautiful and contrasted. So without reducing the opacity, it's back to number one, but we still need to figure out how to solve all of these contrast issues that we have here. Now, one way to do that that is very, very common is we can use something like gradient. So I can create here just kind of a rectangular and change this into a gradient. Let's change this into a linear gradient, and we'll do it from black to, not gray actually, to also black but with 0 opacity, and we're going to change this to be from right to left. And by doing this, and let's make sure it's corrected, and let's give it a little bit more. Let's not make it 100% here at the beginning. We want to see a little bit of the image, and we're going to bring the gradient below all of the text. Now here's what I did with this layer, and you can see it if I turn it off. I just made part of the image darker, and by making part of the image darker, I've increased the contrast of this whole area. So basically this now works, right? And I can, if I want to make this more beautiful, I should probably make this not just like a complete black, but actually just kind of like a very dark green would probably fit better with the forest. But this is not the video about color, so we'll dive into color in a different video. Now, one thing that we have here as a problem is that we also can't see right now the navigation. So we still have a problem here that this is disappearing. We can solve this with another kind of a overlay, and let's try something else this time. Let's try to create an overlay. Let's do black just for this one and bring it on top of the other gradient. But in this case, note that even if I bring down the opacity of this, let's zoom in so you can see it. Even if we bring down the opacity of this element, because we have so much details here in the background, it's still a little bit confusing or not really contrasted to read the text here. So one thing that we can do is add a blur effect. So let's add a background blur effect. Remember when we said that blur is another way to create depth, is another way to create hierarchy. So now when the details in the background are blurred, even if the opacity of this layer is lower, it's still easier to read what's on these buttons because we can't see the details in the background, so this stands out more. So now we've kind of solved for the second demands, which we have images grabbing our attention as number one. Probably we actually might want to decrease this here, just so it would be actually easier, we don't want the text to conflict too much with people looking first at the image, right? We want them to look at the traveler first. We want them to see this beautiful cabin and only then move here. So it makes sense to decrease this a little bit. However, let's try to keep 3 hierarchies, but revert again back to, I want the cabin to be number 1, the title to be number 1, and then I want the images number 2, and then the cabin at number 3. So let's rearrange the hierarchies. And one way to do that would actually be, let's try to actually crop this image. Okay, so let's imagine that we want the image to be in kind of a frame, and we can do this however we want. And let's make the image and these, let's mask the image in here. All right, so now, of course, we can play around with this background and maybe pick a foresty dark green to make it look more in line. But by cropping the image, we've actually reduced the amount of the amount of visual impact that this image have. I should probably recrop this to center this person. And again, I want this headline to be, again, the number 1 priority. So maybe make it bigger, maybe even make it bigger than even before to kind of, and maybe even bring it on top. It's a little bit unreadable. But something like this. Now let's align these. Something like this can definitely fit the bill of, you know, we're seeing the heading as number 1, image as number 2, and then button as number 3. So as you can see, the options of playing around with hierarchies are endless. All you need to do is make the decision about what should be number 1, number 2, number 3, and then use the tools that we talked about to rearrange the element to create these hierarchies. All right, so to sum up what we've covered in this chapter, first, you must have a clear understanding of what are the hierarchies that you want to create. You can't not have hierarchies, right? You'll just have a mess on your page. So be very, very clear about what is the top hierarchy, secondary hierarchy, and third hierarchy. And then make sure that you use all the tools that we've covered to create distinctions between them. Now, the second thing is you don't want to have too many things as the most important thing or even the secondary thing. Remember, there can only be one commander, one CEO. Make your decision about what is most important, secondary, and then all the rest is the rest. And the third thing, when you finish designing, squint your eyes and try to make sure that the hierarchies are actually clear and contrasted and we're not actually confused about which hierarchy is which.